So the news this week, in fact the news today, is that China is relaxing the restrictions pretty rapidly. In Xinjiang last week they began to remove the restrictions. In Guangzhou there was a demonstration on Monday, and it was migrant workers. There was a bit of a clash between the authorities and the migrant workers, and the authorities then began to relax restrictions in Guangzhou within a matter of days. And now in Beijing, where they had this sort of lunatic decision, similar to in Italy, for example, or in Spain, I think in France as well, in Germany, where you had to have a PCR test in order to get onto a train or a bus. They're removing those restrictions as well. So basically China is on the edge of removing all the restrictions around coronavirus. But what I did this week was I spent a bit of time, some people know I made some videos this week about these questions. One of them I put out yesterday was to answer the lies being circulated in the Western media about these issues, because over the last 2.5 years, whenever there were protests, which began here in Hyde Park with Piers Corbyn and some of his associates in April 2020, right? In April 2020, we faced repression on a scale almost unknown in British history. One time after another, whenever people gathered to demonstrate, the police would come, harass people, arrest people. There was someone sat down, this video of this, someone sitting down for a cup of coffee and was arrested brutally by the police. A young girl, she must have been about 16 or 15 years of age, tackled to the ground by the police and brutally arrested. Another young black woman on the gates of the entrance here, brutally arrested. Myself chased around the park by the police. Nick from Speaker's Corner, I saw earlier on, brutally arrested by the police at Speaker's Corner for making a comical remark about one of the police officers, Sergeant Berry. Attempts to have people charged with all sorts of framed up and cooked up charges over the last 2.5 years. And protests reached a scale that was almost, the main thing that was unprecedented was these demonstrations were not supported by any of the mainstream media, and they were not disseminated, information about them was not disseminated on any mainstream social media networks. They were all blocking or isolating people who advocated these things, advocated going on demonstrations, advocating opposition to compulsory vaccinations, advocated opposition to maintaining cash or to opposing vaccine passports, advocated opposition to lockdown measures, social distancing, constant sanitizing the hands and so on. All those people who advocated for those ideas were denigrated and attacked in the media as plague rats, as people who should be isolated from society, as people who are anti-science, as people who were a danger to everybody else. And then there were adverts about people, you know, act like you've got the virus. You know, they had pictures of people on ventilators.
Except they were all
and they, well, I mean, some may have been actors. I mean, they were employed, obviously, to put something on the as an advertisement. And then they also put out lots of stories. You might remember, if you take ivermectin, then you're advocating people using horse tranquilizer. If you advocate for hydroxychloroquine, then you're anti-science. Now, that's got nothing to do with the merits or demerits of these things. It's the fact that you were not allowed to criticize the official line in Britain on COVID, on the lockdowns, on the measures taken. You were not allowed to question those things in social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, or in the local community. Even amongst families, people were turned one against another.
That's
on
right.
The basis that you can't come to visit me at Christmas because you aren't vaccinated. That was the game. You can't work in a care home because you aren't vaccinated. And they sacked 40,000 care home workers who were looking after some of the most vulnerable people in Britain.
Bastards.
You know, and the social care system was bad enough without losing 40,000. And then they wanted to sack 100,000 NHS workers if they refused to take the vaccinations that were being pushed by Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca, but Pfizer in particular in Britain. And now this week, anybody who turned on the television, anybody who looked in the newspapers, you all heard the radio, you will have seen a barrage of stories in the Western media claiming that in China there is a heroic uprising of the people against lockdown measures. Channel 4 broadcast a protest in China where people were shouting out, "Down with PCR tests!" Channel 4 and the BBC broadcasting this. They were saying, look, there are anti-lockdown protests in China. These heroes, we were told. On the BBC this week, it's heroic now to oppose PCR tests. It's heroic to demonstrate against lockdowns. That's what we're told. And the BBC even said, they said China has been in lockdown for 3 years. That is not true. Much of China has never had a lockdown. Hong Kong, for example, never had a lockdown. Much of the rest of China never had a lockdown. And yet we are in a country where we had a national lockdown in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland for longer lockdowns in Britain than having happened in China. And yet we are told the Chinese are heroic when they protest, and we are plague rats when we protest. You can't have your cake and eat it. Either everyone who protests against lockdowns is a plague rat, or nobody who protests against lockdowns is a plague rat. Instead, they are heroes. I take the latter attitude. It was heroic for so many people in Britain to stand up against the state when they imposed regulations which were quite frankly out of some page of a lunatic asylum.
Absolutely.
They turned the whole country and the whole world into a lunatic asylum.
That's right.
People began to behave like they were mentally insane. Every time you saw someone, people jumped out the way. There are barriers across the road here, put there by Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London. They are blue barriers. On the blue barriers, they have signs. They moved them into the street, occupied half of the road, and it said, "Street safe," from the Mayor of London. In other words, you're supposed to walk on the pavement in the open air from the spring of 2020 until today, because I saw many of them over the last few days are still there, with the signs on them, with an arrow pointing a distance of 2+ meters between you, that those barriers in the street are supposed to be designed to stop you catching coronavirus. You can't make this shit up. Insane. And yet everywhere in Europe and everywhere in the world, that is what we saw. Madness, run riot on the floor. There were yellow signs and blue signs saying, keep your distance from other people on the street.
Because you could get infected.
Yes, for sure. Oh, yes, for sure. In Hammersmith and Fulham, they had signs made of plastic hanging from every lamppost which said, keep a car distance apart. 1 car distance apart from the other car in the whole of Hammersmith and Fulham. And this was our local government looking after our health. That's what we've been told.
That's mad.
No.
Why?
Then they said, you know, nowadays, so look at this guy. He's telling us that this was all true.
He's brainwashed by his teachers.
My friend, how do we know that you are asymptomatic right now? And passing it to this poor old man as we sit here. How do we know that? You're certainly within 2 meters distance of him.
No vaccine.
And yet,
He's within
one of the most concerned people for supporting such an argument no longer practice these arguments.
Can I give you a hug?
We don't want to die of
I'm genuinely really
My friend.
Thank you.
I'm genuinely
So,
really happy that you survived. You know, you should get the vaccine.
you would survive.
sorry, my friend. He's running away. He doesn't actually want to engage. So he turned around and said to this guy, on what knowledge, who knows, to take a vaccine. He didn't say what vaccine. He just said take the vaccine. Now, that's always been one of the great cons in Britain, hasn't it? Take the vaccine. What, the smallpox vaccine? The AstraZeneca vaccine? The Cuban vaccine? The Chinese vaccine? The Russian vaccine? AstraZeneca? Pfizer? Moderna? Johnson & Johnson? The Colombian vaccines? The Brazilian vaccines? There were 240 different vaccines made for coronavirus. Which one is the one you should take? One of the stories circulating this week in the news media in Britain has been that the reason China has been in lockdown up until today, and they made out China was in permanent lockdown from 2020 until today, even though lockdowns in China have been shorter duration than those in Britain. But what they're saying is now is that China, I think Joe Biden even said it, China must open up. Rishi Sunak said China must listen to the protesters. Did they listen to the protesters in Britain? Did they once say we should listen to the anti-lockdown protesters in Britain? Never once. Every time these were lunatics, plague rats and purveyors of disease. And now they're saying China must listen to the West, must copy the West. What that means is China must accept the Pfizer mRNA vaccines. Now, China has got a history of having Western drugs forced upon them. In fact, there were 2 wars which determined the character and shape of the Chinese nation for the last 150 years. And those were the Opium Wars, because Britain couldn't sell goods that were of any value to the Chinese population. So they said, well, what we'll do is we'll force them to take opium produced by the British in India. And they got hundreds of thousands and millions addicted in China. And when the Emperor of China said we're not going to take this, then the British went to China and bombed China twice, sent in the fleet and attacked Guangzhou, stole Hong Kong, Macau was taken as well, and they bombed China in 2 opium wars, in order to force China to take opium. Now, that began what the Chinese call a century of humiliation at the hands of the Western powers. And that was one of the background factors in the Chinese Revolution, 1911, and in the 1949 revolutions. Now, what is it the Western companies want today? Is there not also a danger that if they were to get their way in China, imagine the Chinese government collapsed and welcomed in the Western countries, the Western pharmaceutical companies, what would happen? The Chinese would have the same problem that the United States has got, and it's known as the opioid epidemic. 10 million people in China, in America, in the United States of America, are addicted to opiates provided to them by the drug companies in the name of pain killing. Every year in the last 10 years, about 100,000 people, average age of 41, have died as a result of the opioid epidemic forced on them by American pharmaceutical companies, official and legal pharmaceutical companies, forced the American population to become addicted to opioids. And that led, as I said, 2021, for example, to 100,000 dead in America that year. Now, according to the official statistics, about 1 million people in America have died from or with coronavirus. But what's the average age of those people who died, according to their calculations, from or with coronavirus? It's way over 65, 70 years of age. It hovers around the average life expectancy, as it did in Europe, as it did in Britain. A little bit lower in the United States. And yet the age at which 100,000 people died from opioids in America in 2021 is 41 years of age. So actual life years lost, quality life years lost, is higher in the 2 years of the pandemic from opioid in the United States of America, prescription opioid in the United States of America, than it is from or with coronavirus in the United States of America. And yet, the Western companies want to get the Chinese to take these mRNA vaccines, and once they would do that, if the Chinese would do it, then they would import all the other Western medicines into China as well. Now, one other story they said this week was the old people in China do not want to be vaccinated. It said on one report on Channel 4 that 50% of over 80s have yet to be injected by the Chinese vaccine. In fact, it's not correct. Far more than that have been injected. Most have had 1 or 2, but they haven't taken a third booster. Most Chinese elderly people, or a large number of Chinese elderly people, do not believe in Western medicine and do not believe in vaccination.
That's right.
It's a historical and cultural phenomenon.
Absolutely.
They've had their own medicine.
Correct.
For 3,000 years.
Here, here.
And that medicine is composed of plants and herbs and various vitamins included in roots and so on. And that's what they take. One of the things they recommended is forsythia, chrysanthemum, licorice for coronavirus. That's what's recommended by the Chinese government through traditional Chinese medicine for the people of China. So, what they've said here, however, is you can't advocate such a thing. Chinese traditional medicine cannot. Now, we all know there is placebo effect. There is nocebo effect. So even if there was no benefit whatsoever from the Chinese medicine that the government advocates in China, still it can have a placebo effect on the population. As, for example, any drug can have in any country, or even going to see a doctor sometimes. You know how it is, you can go to the doctor's surgery, you've got a terrible back pain, and as you get into the door of the surgery, it begins to go away. And then you speak to the doctor for 10 minutes, and they have a quick chat about your general health, and then you start, oh, it's not that bad anymore, I think I'm going to go away, I don't really need anything. Often it's the case, that, and in fact, with non-traditional medicine, it's often the case that the doctor will spend, or that your healer will spend 20 minutes or half an hour talking to you. And because they talk to you, they might even touch your body, whereas maybe a lot of people, 70, 80-year-olds, nobody touches their body. So they just might touch their body a little, then they feel better. So, whether or not Chinese medicine is efficacious for COVID-19, if the people believe it is, and they carry out a regimen of health in Chinese medicine, you start from the proposition all human beings are divided between male and female essence. And male and female essence also corresponds with what they call hot and cold. And the doctor will look at your tongue to determine what's wrong. They won't take your blood sample and say, oh, you've got an infection with X, Y, and Z. In fact, they don't believe that infections per se cause illnesses. They believe that weaknesses in the body, because of a lack of preparation in the previous season of your bodily strength,
that's right,
internally and mentally, your shanti, your internal spirit of your body, if you haven't paid attention to that and you don't pay attention to nutrition, why do you think Chinese food is so varied? Why do you think they got such peculiar dishes? Why do you go to a restaurant that's got 600 things on the menu?
How much stress you're under causes it as well? How much stress you're under?
Because food is considered to be an essential health care treatment. What you eat determines what you are, as well as how you exercise. If you do Qigong or Tai Chi, and in India they do yoga.
They do yoga over here as well.
True.
They do
Is
yoga
it a bad
everywhere.
thing? Is it a bad thing?
I wouldn't think so.
Heiko, you know that stress also affects you as well, with illnesses as well.
You know, there was a ridiculous
It's the biggest
study,
killer.
a humorous study, peer-reviewed study published last week or the week
Why are
before
you
that I
opposing
saw.
it?
Sorry?
I mean, it's peer review. Do you reject any sort of education?
I've got a PhD myself. Now, a peer-reviewed study was published last week, or I saw it last week, and it said one of the reasons that people have died after getting vaccinations, it said, is because anti-vaxxers have been running a campaign to spread the idea that there are dangers from taking these vaccinations. And because people fear that the vaccination might be dangerous, their blood vessels constrict. And if they see a picture of Piers Corbyn, they constrict even more. And then they might get a heart attack. I'm serious. That was published in a peer-reviewed journal. Of course, it would naturally follow, as they said, that if fear can cause a heart attack, and it almost certainly can, what about the fear campaign, don't kill your granny? What about the fear campaign, you can infect your family? What about the fear campaign, don't leave your home? What about the fear campaign, stand 2 meters apart? What about the fear campaign, don't visit anybody, don't go for Christmas? Christmas is a deadly time. You might kill your family, your neighbor, your child might kill your grandparents. Wasn't that a fear campaign which might cause a constriction of the blood vessels and thereby cause illnesses in the body, heart attacks, strokes and other ailments? Now, according to the data in Britain and in America and in Canada and in Germany and much of Europe and much of the world, excess deaths compared with before coronavirus are running at between 10 and 20%. In Britain, I think the figure is around 1,500 excess deaths last week in all age groups, from all cause mortality, excluding coronavirus. So the question many people have been asking, for example, the famous doctor and nurse, Dr. John Campbell, he keeps returning to the subject. How can it be there are 1,500 excess deaths every week at the moment in Britain, and yet not a single newspaper, not a single television program has bothered, or radio show, has bothered to ask the question, why are there 10 to 20% more deaths happening now than before 2019 on the 5-year average of that time? Why are there so many excess deaths from all cause mortality in all age groups? And of course, we are not allowed to mention a certain intervention which some people might think is responsible for this. So instead we're led up the garden path into discussing all sorts of strange and varied options. For example, the idea that lockdowns prevented you accumulated immunity, and you might therefore have caught something else and be dying from that. Or treatment wasn't provided, which is true, wasn't provided during the pandemic, and therefore undiscovered illnesses are coming to the fore. That's also true. But I do... Sorry? What's that? Well, just cycle through us, madam. Cycle through us. Be brave. Be wise. Who are these idiots? You know?
What did I say to you? What did I say?
Well, there would be one idiot. One idiot. Are there any questions from the audience or contributions?
Are these people dying from the corona jab?
Just this morning, the video channel that I'm broadcasting this on had its strike removed. So yesterday was the final date of the 90-day quarantine that this YouTube channel had to go through. If I was to say something like you just implied, this channel would receive another 90-day strike. So literally, basically, we live like in Russia in the old days, or in China, that you have to censor what you say when you say it in public at Speaker's Corner if you want to have an audience for what you're saying beyond the remit of this particular crowd here. And so, although the gentleman here said that the vaccination might be causing excess deaths, that cannot be true, because YouTube says it isn't true. And anybody who says it on YouTube will be defined as a COVID denier and spreading misinformation. And therefore, nobody would want to spread misinformation, least of all me. And therefore, it cannot be true, if YouTube says so and Google says so, that vaccinations are causing any deaths, or certainly not beyond the ones that are known by the medical authorities and reported by them. We're not, of course. However, one interesting thing is, I've been studying this question this week. You know, many people were in despair because so many people ran to get the jabs without really knowing what was in them or the risks associated with them. And there was a huge propaganda campaign for everyone in the country and everyone in the world to roll up, roll up, roll up for the great mRNA jab treatment of the population, which of course we were told would stop you getting coronavirus. It did not. Would stop you transmitting coronavirus. It did not. Would stop you dying of coronavirus. The evidence is argued based on the fact that the number of people who are dying after having been infected with coronavirus now is lower than it was in 2020. However, there is also an argument which is quite widespread in the peer-reviewed scientific papers, which shows that the so-called Omicron variant has a far lower pathogenicity. In other words, it's less deadly. And if it's less deadly, how do you work out whether it was the vaccine that reduced the deaths or whether the virus itself is less dangerous and therefore the deaths went down because of that? That, of course, we will know if we look at communities and people who were not vaccinated. Any of them around the world, like Africa, for example. Most of Africa had Omicron infection. Most of Africa, very few deaths. I didn't mean to say no. Sorry, YouTube, I'll correct it.
Michael, did you know about that 4-year-old Argentinian poster boy who was the poster boy for the vaccines, to get vaccinated, and then he died?
I mean,
You didn't hear about
there
that?
are many cases like
He
that.
died,
You know, I've
ago.
seen pictures.
He was a poster boy for the vaccine.
Of course, it's propaganda
died.
to believe this.
You know,
When you've seen pictures of sports people dropping down dead, young children dying suddenly without anybody knowing why.
You've got fact checker now basically trying to deny about that this boy died because of the
Well, I'm just so glad there are fact checkers around, because if there were not fact checkers around, you know, these people who got an English degree qualification and get employed by Microsoft and Facebook and Twitter finance organizations which claim to be fact checking, then nobody would know what the truth is.
Heiko, I got a question, please.
It's very important to have these people to check the facts. Otherwise, the whole world would be so ignorant that they would be dropped. They would all be dead of coronavirus because nobody would have taken the vaccination.
I've got a question. I don't know if you can answer it though, but I'll still ask it anyway. So just to clarify, do you believe, or I'd like to ask, do you think any governments at all have conspired to have this big scare factor with this whole COVID to basically benefit in some way financially and others, the fear factor to benefit them and for the hierarchies around the world? Do you think any governments have been involved?
One of the most powerful selling tools of international capitalism and international power is fear. I mean, I grew up when they used to have this television. They had this special guy like a weather forecaster, and he had this clock, the "we're about to be annihilated" clock. And 1979, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, they said it's 1 minute to midnight. 1980, during Solidarność,
I was there
the
too.
workers' movement in Poland, they said we're 5 minutes to midnight. And then sometime when there was a negotiation, they'd say we've gone back to 15 minutes to midnight. And then suddenly in the last few months, we're back up there, right up the top again. Nuclear war, they started talking about it again a few months ago, didn't they? Oh, Putin is threatening nuclear war. We're on the edge of nuclear annihilation. And then they said earlier on the coronavirus, well, they're not just coronavirus, we don't have to talk about coronavirus. In 2009, the World Health Organization changed the definition of what a pandemic is.
That's right.
From an illness killing many people in many countries to a flu-like illness spreading to many countries at once. There is a difference. And that allowed them to say that the swine flu pandemic of 2009 was a pandemic. In fact, Neil Ferguson, our great Imperial College mastermind, claimed that over 500,000 people will die in Britain from swine flu. Earlier, our great genius Neil Ferguson claimed that millions will die from mad cow disease. At the time of bird flu, our great hero Neil Ferguson also claimed that hundreds of thousands, I think 250,000 would die in Britain of bird flu. When he predicted, Matt Hancock, my friend, Matt Hancock, he predicted he said Chris Whitty came to him. This is in the Daily Mail, so it must be true.
What about AIDS as well?
AIDS, they also said, would kill hundreds of millions in the world. Now, the fact is, every single prediction that they made cooked up the fear factor.
That's right.
And that gets, you see, the WHO is lobbied. How you doing, man? All right?
Very good, very good.
Before the Ai Weiwei is coming in, it's not really yet.
Okay.
And when it gets here,
Press on,
press
on.
So, the
right.
idea is
Jolly
to
good.
promote fear, to set the minds of the masses into a state where they're prepared to take drugs that are offered to them, even if the drugs have only been tried out for a short period of time. And for companies to get contracts from national governments to purchase drugs they've been working on for years or decades in advance. And now there's an organisation, I think it's called CEPI, isn't it?
Yes,
CEPI.
it is.
I think it's the Centre for Epidemiology or something like this. It's a planning organisation, and they have got a plan, their international pandemic plan, because now they talk about the next pandemic, right? That's what we're preparing for, the next pandemic. And they say to us, it's not if, but when the next pandemic comes. That's what they're saying. And the next pandemic is to be fought by CEPI, an international organisation drawing together governments, the WHO, Bill Gates and the vaccine producers. They are going to manufacture The aim is this: within 100 days, they will manufacture vaccines to be rolled out to the entire population of the world within a few months. That is the plan they have. Now, if you have a conspiratorial mind, like Piers Corbyn here, then you might think these people are engaging in a dangerous experiment to seize control,
Of course.
of the marketplace of the world,
Of course.
the insides of our bodies.
Here.
Because selling you an iPhone is one thing. Selling you some...
Before we change the subject,
Sorry?
before we change the subject, all the viruses you mentioned were used in scaremongering and fear promotion, and most of them never hit the spot. Do you believe that virus exists, that we can catch, that can float through the air? Because the germ theory has been denounced a long time ago by the guy that invented it.
Well, the gentleman here is talking about a theory about viruses which is perfectly legitimate to discuss, but it's not perfectly legitimate to discuss it in relation to coronavirus, because coronavirus, the WHO has said, does exist and is caused by SARS-CoV-2, and anybody who says that isn't true is cut off YouTube. And therefore, from a simple pragmatic point of view, I will answer you only in relation to the theory itself rather than the specifics of coronavirus and SARS-CoV-2, because otherwise we'll be breaking community guidelines, and nobody wants to do that.
You know it's never been isolated.
Now, one minute.
And the PCR.
I do not, however, I am not of the opinion that the theory of the isolation of viruses put forward by, for example, Kaufman, Bailey and others is actually adequate to contradict the argument that you can catch something from somebody else. Now, I don't want to go into great detail on this because I'm not an expert, and I'd prefer that experts. And I've got plenty of people. I've got plenty of people in Hyde Park who advocate for those points of views and can advocate their point of view far more effective than I can. What I can do, however, is related to an immediate question: the question of Chinese traditional medicine.
That's right.
It does not start from the principle of the existence of viruses. Instead of this, it starts from the body and its nutrition and its condition. Now, I think there is a synergy between the arguments of some of the people who argue for what's called terrain theory. In other words, your body is a terrain that can protect itself against most illnesses,
That's right.
provided you look after it. I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument that can be verified by any example of someone who lives a relatively healthy life and someone who lives an unhealthy life. Someone who's taking large amounts of ketamine is smoking huge amounts of cigarettes and drinking loads of alcohol and eating, a builder's breakfast every single day, is likely to be less healthy and has got a huge gain of weight, is likely to be less healthy than someone who's eating relatively careful diet, does a fair amount of exercise, and keeps their mental and physical state in a good condition. I think that's hardly a controversial discussion. And in fact, the whole of medicine and the knowledge of human bodies has been like this. Even back in 10,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, our ancestors, yes, many of them died at a very young age, but once they got beyond 7, 8, 9 years of age, the life expectancy was not much different to the life expectancy today.
That's right.
And yet there was no modern medicine in those days.
That's right.
And people took alchemy. If they took anything, alchemy, herbs, spices, people tested out. I've seen people living in the jungle with barely any clothes on their bodies. And when they lived in the jungle, one sec, they take plants and herbs and animals, and they learn and they pass down the generations their knowledge about folk medicine. I've taught in China, and when I taught in Shanghai, I was teaching experts who are Western medicine experts, neurologists, psychologists, but also, I also taught folk medicine doctors. I taught Chinese traditional medicine doctors. And they told me what they're doing is that was 1990, they scour the country and discover in each community what the folk medicines have been. And from that folk medicine knowledge, they take these products and they test them out in controlled experiments to see whether or not these folk medicines from the past are valid and reliable today.
Dr. Heiko, I got one question.
And they found many of them are.
We have the same doctor.
Dr. Heiko, I got one question. Last question from me. Quick question and quick answer, please. To do with FIFA. See, this England are playing today. It's relevant. Do you think, because Russia was banned from the World Cup, do you think England should have been banned from the World Cup because of their behaviour over the years with certain, and things like that?
I think that all these punitive measures, you know, there's one thing after another now. The so-called cancel culture is pure insanity. You know, this week we had this story about this lady in waiting to the Queen who asked someone, where are you from? That person was black.
Where are you really from? Where are you from? I want to know. Where are you from, please?
Ask me where you're from.
Where are you from?
I enjoy it. I say, well, I'm half Chinese, half German. Then they say, you're not Chinese. You don't look Chinese at all, you know. Stuff like that. I enjoy that. If you meet someone in the United States of America and you ask them, where are you from? They'll come out with a string of their family history going back. I'm a quarter Navajo Indian. I'm a 15th Italian. I'm a 20th Polish Jewish.
In my opinion,
that's what they'll do.
In my opinion, it's normally just an innocent conversation starter so people,
it is a
if they've
fake
been there,
narrative that these people are offending. And even if it was offensive, so what?
Exactly.
You turn round to the person and say, I find that offensive.
And the story.
Where are you from, you stupid cow? Something like that. Someone else will turn around and say, how can you say that woman is a cow? Isn't that denigrating women? And then I'd say, no, not in Hindu culture, where they worship the cow. Oh, it's so much nonsense. The media is full of shit. They want to fill your brain with the shit they're full of. Nothing but rubbish every day. You know, they had this thing about the gays, lesbians and transsexuals in Qatar. Why did they want to go and play in Qatar if they're worried about it? I don't have any problem with people being lesbian, gay or transsexual at all. But the idea that the World Cup, I mean, of all the people, the English football team, where there isn't one single gay footballer in the whole of the English Football League. Not one single gay footballer. In Germany, you know, they made a protest about it. You're not protecting one love gayness and lesbian transsexual rights in Qatar. So the German football team made a huge hoo-ha about this. We're protecting the rights of gender difference. Is there a single gay footballer in Germany? One?
Yes.
Not one. So what are they bloody on about? Obviously there are, and they're not saying they're gay. So what are they talking about? Protesting about it. They feel the same pressure that people in Qatar feel about being gay. And by the way,
the chemtrails.
I met friends from Iran. I've been to Pakistan. You know, officially in Muslim culture, there are no gays, right? Officially in Muslim culture. But in reality, there's a place in Pakistan, a mosque, where the men gather at the mosque like this, and then the young boys come in and they all rub up against them, right? In a mosque in Afghanistan.
Oh, hello.
In Afghanistan, in tents and camps of the Taliban, they dress up young boys as girls and have sex with them. Right? It's a standard procedure in the Taliban in Afghanistan. They do have sex. Sorry? Yes, they dance, and that's all they do. Yes, I understand that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, Dr. Hayton Cruz, thank you.
Okay. The gentleman is saying they don't have sex with him. I've heard they do, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're right. In Iran, the women the history was to cover a lot of the women up. Certainly after the fall of the Shah and under the Ayatollah. So a friend of mine told me it's very common for men in the heat to wander out feeling a bit horny and go into an alleyway and have sex with each other, right? So what are they talking about? And the royal families in the Middle East are notoriously filled with perverted, by the way, perverted homosexuals who employ basically rent boys.
They're all hypocrites.
To follow them round from one country to another.
They're all hypocrites.
Right? So it's farcical to talk about this question in relation to Qatar and make out, oh, the Western world is protecting freedom, democracy and love amongst the people. What sort of love was promoted when you locked down the entire world for insane reasons for 2 years, and then you claim that the Chinese are causing problems? And in fact, one thing you should note from this week is this. Look at the way a few small protests in China caused the government to change policy.
That's right.
Almost overnight.
That's right.
And yet in Britain, we had to fight tooth and nail for 2 years to get our rights back.
That's right.
That were stolen away from us
Hear.
in the name of fighting coronavirus. To get our rights back, we had to fight. We had to be arrested. We had to be charged. We had to be beaten by the police. We had to defend Speaker's Corner, Christians, Muslims and others. We stood up here when the police came to attack us, to drive us out of the park, to arrest us, accused us of being playground.
No pain, no gain.
Of being anti-science, accused us of being anti-vaxxers. Now they're cheering the protests in China. So in other words, now it is perfectly heroic. And I'll end on this. For our national and international hero of the anti-coronavirus campaigns, here is the man that the BBC now are cheering on. Because what he advocated is what the Chinese are now doing, protesting against coronavirus restrictions. And at that time they said, this man is mad. Now they say, the Chinese protesters are heroes of the world. Rishi Sunak said it. Joe Biden said it.
That's right.
So why can't we say it about our friend Piers Morgan?
Here.
Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hayton Cruz, please.
Hi, I've got a question for you, mate. It's really important. What do you think? Sorry. What do you think about why China is having these lockdowns? What do you think their motives? What do you think the real motives?
I have done some talk about it. It's social unrest. It's social unrest. I have done a few videos about it.
But roughly though, why do you think? Well, let me just quickly answer.
Yeah. Sorry.
So what happened was, when the lockdowns were imposed recently in China, most people in the urban areas live in big tower blocks, right? So, in the history of China up until recent times, the only democratic vote you get is a vote, in other words, where you can vote for different candidates and they're not only Communist Party members, was in the countryside. Village committees are relatively democratic. But in the urban areas, where more than half the population live, there were no democratic institutions. So what did emerge was what they called residence committees. So in the big tower blocks where most people live in China, they have residence committees. So the people who lock down a block, say you live in a big tower block here, in this part of Beijing, and a barrier is put around the tower block, like the barriers on the street here, supposedly to help stop coronavirus. A local government official comes, puts a barrier in front of the door, and a committee is created of doormen and bouncers, like the guys from Sainsbury's who say you can come in, you stay outside, or local council officials who say, you must do this, you must do that, or school teachers who say, you must wash your hands there, you must sanitize there. That type of people gained the power to impose lockdowns. Now, what has happened in the last week, when the protests took to the streets, suddenly everybody in China, inside each tower block that is locked down, they got communication amongst themselves. They have a WeChat group, like a WhatsApp group, in every block of housing. And so you got, let's say, 1,000 people living in a tower block. Suddenly, as a consequence of the coronavirus lockdown, they've all joined up to a WhatsApp group or a WeChat group, and they're all in communication with each other, and they're helping each other, making sure they got food and provisions and medicine and so on. And the consequence of that is, it was reported in the FT a couple of days ago by one of the Western FT reporters inside one of these tower blocks. Someone started complaining. They went downstairs, they talked to the guys on the door, they argued with them. The guys on the door said, we're not letting you do anything. But then they went and got an official. The official then got another official. They came round, and within a few hours they removed all the barriers. Because now you have, building by building, some new forms of democratic representation. And if that was to continue, you might have councils of the people created out of every tower block in China. Yes, on a local basis, emerging spontaneously as a consequence of the actions imposed by overzealous officials. That is what has led to the rapid change in position and to the demand to eliminate all restrictions.
That's
and
right. China
will remove all the restrictions pretty fast. And by the way, they know that as well, because in Vietnam they did it, in Cuba they did it, in Laos they did it. So they can do it in China as well. They know exactly what's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. There isn't going to be widespread deaths in China. There isn't.
That's right.
And that, of course, will undermine the narrative here, because they're telling you everyone's going to die in China now because they aren't vaccinated. Not enough people the over 80s, they're not vaccinated. That's what. And the Chinese vaccine doesn't work, they say. The Chinese vaccine, no matter whether you like it or not, it's a normal vaccine. It's like the flu vax or other vaccines you've had in the past. It didn't receive enough trials. It was rushed out. There have been some recorded side effects, but nothing on a scale like those for AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. Nothing like the scale for that. And that's in countries that have used the vaccine outside China, like Brazil, like Chile, like Mexico, like Vietnam, like Malaysia, like Singapore, where they've used the Chinese vaccine. There are no major side effects reported. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but there are nothing compared to what you've got for the new vaccines. And half the world has had the Chinese vaccines and not the Western vaccines, which I know lots of people, including peers and others, think all vaccines are bad, and I wouldn't take the Sinovac either. But it's certainly less dangerous, and it certainly doesn't bring us into the terrain, the dangerous terrain that has been created by the mRNA rollout.
That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, please Dr. Aiko Koo, thank you.